Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar today. I know it's the end of your week and you decided to spend some time here while you wrap up things for the rest of your weeks. And I hope the title caught you in a hopeful place. And I hope that's why you joined, is to see the other side of the ACEs pyramid and see the healing pieces of what we try to do every day, which is to heal from the impacts of trauma. Our partnership is with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute for your services to provide training and technical assistance. And we're proud to partner with everyone to be able to provide services for you and be a part of this network of support. The National Native Children's Trauma Center's mission is to co-facilitate healing for a trauma-focused healing for Native children, families, and communities. And we believe in trying to make sure that we do this in a collaborative way, that tribes have the decision-making power to decide how healing happens in your communities. And that will be true for today's presentation as well. Although we're talking about a framework, it is simply a framework meant to be localized and implemented however communities see fit. So before we get into today's presentation, I'd just like to say that I will be trying to monitor the chat box as much as I can. So if you do have a question, feel free to interrupt me. I'm not sure that I'll be able to get through all of the questions and stop for all of them, but I hope to also leave time at the end for some question time as well. So I'll do my best to respond. And before I get into the content too, I should tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm Dr. Maegan Rides at the Door. I serve as the director for National Native Children's Trauma Center at the University of Montana. I have been doing this for almost 9 years now, and I worked as a staff member before, prior to becoming a mental health counselor. And although I carry a Blackfeet last name through marriage, I'm an enrolled member of the Fort Peck Dakota and Nakota tribes, or Sioux and Assiniboine tribes in northeastern Montana. And I'm also a descendant of the Absentee Shawnee tribe in Oklahoma. So great to get to know you and happy to stay connected with you even after this presentation. So many people have heard about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and I don't feel like I need to really go into it in depth, but I do feel like just even a couple of weeks ago, I was in a tribal community, and when I asked if people had heard about the study, people are still not aware or haven't heard about it as widespread as we might think. And so I think it is important for us to continue to talk about it and help people understand its findings, and particularly as it relates to our tribal populations and the replication studies that have been done with populations of American Indians. So, this, of course, trauma has been occurring before the Adverse Childhood Experiences study occurred. But it really was a landmark study in being able to really look at the links between early adverse childhood experiences by asking people about their childhood experiences before the age of 18. And so this occurred in the 90s. It was really large people who were included in this. And as they were going through, their routine medical appointment, they would ask them if they experienced 10 specific adverse childhood experiences, and then they did a review of their medical history. And these were the 10 adverse childhood experiences that they've talked about. And they didn't talk about how many times people experience these things, simply if they had experienced these things before the age of 18. So we didn't really know the occurrence of them. And we know that there are many other types of traumas that people experience aside from this list. So it's not an all-encompassing picture of what people have experienced. Yet the findings are still very relevant, and striking to hear about, in that, a lot of people who have experienced multiple events of childhood and are correlated to a higher likely to experience poorer mental health and health outcomes later in life, even beyond what's on the slide here. Many impacts and holistic impacts to a person's being. The original ACE's findings were constructed in a pyramid, but since then, there has been an expanded ACEs pyramid that includes historical and intergenerational trauma as the foundation for which social conditions occur, like houselessness, poverty, hunger, and other things that make it more likely for adverse childhood experiences to occur. And these things occur, and it has impacts on people. And people try to cope with these experiences by engaging in high-risk behaviors or coping in unhealthy ways that lead to those behaviors, if chronic and long-term, have a more likelihood to lead to later disease and problems, health problems for people, and mental health difficulties. And all of that leads to a lower life expectancy. So what we know, especially in my state where I'm joining you from in Montana, Montana has a 20-year lower life expectancy than other Montanans in our state. So we know that this is very real, and that our people experience grief and loss at much higher than other populations because of the impacts. They're great, numerous, and widespread in our communities. There's been many replication studies done in various Indigenous populations. It's more than what's on this slide in particular. Some have utilized the adverse childhood experiences, those 10 incidences specifically. Others have altered it to ask about other types of traumas that someone has experienced, but pretty much with the same results regardless. Many people endorse trauma, and when asked if they have experienced these things in childhood. Not surprising, I don't think. So it really has really public safety, health challenges. It's pretty widespread, systemic impacts on how we function in our communities and the resources that we have individually, at the family level, community level, and systemically. But we know all this. We've been, having a lot of exposure to a lot of trauma information, even within the last 20 years. And most people, when they encounter learning about trauma, we're learning about the adverse childhood experiences study and its results of this correlational impacts, that, they want to know, what now? What do we do about it? What's our role? How can we mitigate the impacts of trauma? And really what that means, really broadly is how do we turn this around from having lower life expectancy to not just living longer just because, but hopefully meaningful, hopefully so that our people can be elders and really carry out their role in our community and have and generate the wisdom that we need in our communities to. So the rationale for it really comes from our work. We talk about trauma quite a bit, and it's natural to want to talk about the healing side and the hopeful side of how we mitigate the impacts of trauma, that and carry hopeful messages that inspire people to really validate your work as part of the healing effort. So we want to focus more on being strengths-based and the healing pieces versus the deficits. And we realize that it's not just one entity that's part of the healing process, but it's more comprehensive than that. And, with trauma having so many impacts comprehensively, it makes sense that we would have a community-wide effort to help mitigate the impacts of trauma. And it acknowledges the work already happening. There's a lot already. I like to point out a lot of ways in which we've healed even within the last 10 years. I can find some specific examples of cultural revitalization, and really seeing a lot of growth happen, and even more tribal self-determination, and more work, a lot of innovations that people have been doing in their communities. And all of that really gives us hope for change. And so the other side is really also comprehensive in that it does start with really realizing that, for a lot of communities have not had decision-making power to decide how healing happens in communities. A lot of that is dictated through funding sources, or because of the work itself, it has prevented organizations and community-wide efforts to come together to really be part of the decision-making process. And it's important for that to occur for multiple reasons, but I think, for most everyone, there's a lot of external things that come our ways, and it's, there's a lot of practices and interventions that have been developed, and it makes sense that we would have local decision-making power to help design this for ourselves, and that because if you have a practice or an intervention itself, in and of itself, might be trauma responsive, or healing informed, but if it's not implemented in a trauma responsive way, it can almost defeat the purpose. And I feel like if we're implementing or creating something healing, the process of it should feel healing. It should feel like we are coming together in this way and uplifting tribal sovereignty and being able to focus on a lot of loss that did happen by cultural revitalization and turning to traditional healing and traditional knowledge. I just saw the other day the Pope had uplifted and supported traditional knowledge in a statement. So, and we do really need thriving and safe communities in all its effort, right? All of those social conditions. And all of this really means the prevention of adverse childhood experiences to occur and to continue to occur. You know, one of the things that I've noticed is that we know people heal from trauma. We know it's not only possible, but it's probable. We know that a lot of people have healed from trauma and never received an evidence-based trauma treatment. And I say that not to diminish evidence-based trauma treatment, but to realize that there are multiple avenues of healing and systems and communities of support that help to create healing and support healing in the communities. So I think that's can be helpful to think about in terms of healing. I think so we know healing happens. We know it's possible. You all probably know, even if it's yourself or somebody that you know people who have experienced trauma yet have been able to function, work, give back, even help support others in your communities, and have been able to heal in various ways. And so I think that's hopeful. I think one of the things that does inhibit our ability to heal even more so, or at a more rapid rate, is the continual trauma and grief and loss that our people face cumulatively. And that interrupts our healing trajectory, so to speak. And so I think the conversation is moving toward preventing adverse childhood experiences in the first place, or at least mitigating it as much as we can to help people be able to heal, you know, in this way. So I think that there's a lot of examples of healing processes that provide positive family and community experiences, and provide corrective experiences in our communities. And that's really hopeful, to be able to implement and have, we think about what that means for our community on an intentional level. You know, what do we need in our communities? What's available in the evening, after hours? Where is it safe? Economically, are we thriving and providing people with opportunities and pathways in this area? And it's all really connected, and I think we've really known that for a really long time, that a lot of the issues that our communities face are connected, and that a lot of things that we do help support a lot of different issues at the same time. So we're already doing a lot of things, which is great. I could see in a lot of our systems, and there's always people, probably you out there, that are already trauma informed, already maybe have the lens, but we haven't been able to do that organizationally, or systematically or comprehensively, and kind of radiated that out. And we really do that by thinking about what that means, our developing our social, emotional, and cultural identity development, and aligning it with our cultural values and coping skills. So what I say is that trauma impacts our ability to really live out our cultural values, it's not that we know what our cultural values are. You know, people tell us about them. We're revitalizing that information. It's becoming more widespread about that, but it prevents our ability to really live that out day in and day out. And so I feel like they're connected. The way that we live and thinking about what it means to be trauma informed are really, really overlapping in a lot of different ways. We think about our cultural values around how we treat each other and how we interact with each other. I always say that having a trauma lens means I have no enemies, because you're always able to see the function of behavior through this lens. And I'll be able to go into more depth, but you know, we are seeking, and we already know, and our culture already has taught us about wellness and balance and what that may mean for your particular community. And it's not that there will be no trauma. I don't want to be realistic, you know, unrealistic here, like zero trauma. That would be really nice. There might still be traumas that continue to occur sometimes, you know, natural disasters, or there might still be trauma that occurs, but overall seeking some kind of wellness and balance, and that we can get more widespread and ahead of it. And all of this way in which we live our lives and treat one another, and really how we go about our day and work and services that we provide, all of this helps us be able to move toward healing in a broad way. So it's meant, I feel like this framework is meant to be broad. It's required to be broad because it's comprehensive, but I hope that you can see that it's not just one way, and that it's collective. Everyone has a role in this. There's not one person that's left out of moving towards these efforts. So really thinking about the lens that we take on, I'll say that for myself, even trying to become a mental health professional, I learned about trauma. I learned about the symptoms of trauma. But even when I graduated, I didn't have the trauma lens in which to perceive people, behaviors, and situations. And this takes a different lens to be able to view things in this way. It does require us to be able to not be in a stress response state ourselves, and be able to look through this lens. And the reason for looking through this lens is to respond intentionally versus reacting to things around us. And so we look at this more collectively, asking ourselves, you know, shifting from what's wrong to what's happened at these various levels, because it takes into account trauma that has happened. And even if the behavior or situation isn't due to trauma, it still helps us respond in a way that provides connection instead of disconnection. And that's what's so revolutionary about becoming trauma responsive, and why it's becoming so widespread, is that it's about a way of being in the world. And it helps us align with who we are as Indigenous people, and be in alignment with our cultural values and how we want to be as a community, and really helping us get to this place. So it's really meaningful and impactful, not just on a professional level, but also a personal level. And we think about trauma really specifically to how people experience it. Thinking of the various perspectives people may have of how Indigenous people conceptualize it, events that occur in more often in some communities and not others. How do they perceive this? Are there words in the tribal language that talk about such an experience, that gives us insight into how the community defines it, how it's exhibited, how norms influence what we see and behaviors that are occurring, and yeah, the impacts and how that could be exhibited differently. And we think about, how do people think about how healing happens, and how that may be different depending upon who you ask. So it's a lot of factors go into how people both experience it and then also heal from it in various ways. And for us in our work, I think, we hope that people don't become dysregulated. We hope a parent won't come in and get really angry at us and yell at us for something. We hope a kid won't have an outburst, but the likely reality is that it will happen. It's just a matter of when. And that helps us, that frame of understanding helps us realize that we have really a state of mind around responding instead of reacting. How can we think about what we're doing? I'm going to stop here because it sounds like we have some questions potentially, or maybe there were hands raised and I didn't see them. But I want to stop and say, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. There's a lot of introductions in the chat, so I'm not sure if I can scroll through here what's happening, but yeah, feel free to do that if you have anything. Or you can wait for the end. I do plan to leave some time at the end for some discussion too, but it'd be much better interactive if you wanted to ask a question. I'll try and watch that. So what I was, okay, here's the question. Someone says, how can it be communicated to our tribal people that these drugs and alcohol, marijuana does not work in our healing? I think it's a really good question. I think it's hard because it does work, at least in the short term. And it's around, when you think about what's open, what if you're sitting at home in your tribal community, what's available? Is there where would people gather in the community? What's an easy alternative? What can you give me? Support, anything, and I think it's a matter of creating these kinds of things that are just as easy, it's just right there. These are places, these are safe places. These are safe places where youth can go. These are safe places for families to gather. These are places physically, maybe even virtually, but connection is what we're seeking. What's available on the weekend after hours. That's a common thing that we think of when we think about how are we living our life, and what can provide healing to people in connection with that. And I think, most people at utilizing these things can lead to difficulties later on, but they're not thinking about that, right? They're just in the moment. And so it's I don't know if it was on a collective, but I think I hope I answered that question, is that people are struggling and they're looking to absolve the pain anyway, anyone, how. Yeah, and I think it's a collective effort that we have, right? Because that takes a lot to think about. Even, and I think one of the things I want to reiterate is that I know that some of the things I say are easier said than done. Like, oh, let's create a comprehensive community-wide effort that's cross collaboration across agencies. I realized the challenges in that, right? But it's also feels so right that that's also somehow where we need to get to be able to work together and to help heal in this way. It seems so important for, again, prevention of ACEs. Like, there's not one program that can do that for everybody. There's not, every entity has its gaps, its limitations, its funding restrictions. It's can't do it all themselves with the amount of people, even just amount of workers that are in that system. So it really does require a lot of people to be able to work towards this effort, even individually, in how a lot of people are already doing this, but getting more people on board. Someone asks, can you share any traditional healing practices or rituals that have been used within your community to address the effects of ACEs? Certainly. Those are pretty numerous, I would say. And I think one of the things that I'll say, I think participating in activities can be very profound for people to take part in, because it really helps people think about their own identity, and participating in them revitalizes these practices. And so these are pretty widespread in that there's a lot of ways in which these practices are being incorporated, I would say. Even I saw this gathering more recently. They're talking about how IHS can reimburse for traditional healing practices. There's a lot of efforts to recognize that this as practice-based evidence, that is, we wouldn't be engaging in them if they weren't somehow helpful or healing. And we don't need to study them in a Western way. We already know there's they're healing, and we know that people can heal in them. And I think there's a lot of healing practices or a lot of opportunities to engage in these types of activities. I will say one thing, and I'll probably say it later, it's probably on a slide and I can skip it later, but are we participating in these things with regularity and incorporating it into our daily life? Can we lean upon these things in connection with others that in a supportive way? And it doesn't matter whether it's what kind of traditional practice or other kind of practices. Because I want to think about the diversity of our peoples, and some are not engaging in that particular way of healing. So I want to be broad about when I talk about that. But there's lots of examples, certainly, and I think there's a lot of people who will say learning my language or learning about and participating in these practices have been healing for them. So back to this kind of shift of perspective, I do really see a lot of benefit in how having this lens can really break down the barriers of things like lateral violence or lateral oppression in our communities. It's a lens, though, that requires us to be able to have this trauma lens and recognize it and hold it even in the midst of other people not having the lens, so that we have this lens, but realizing that other people don't can be challenging. But yet I do think that having this lens does help us in our own lives, really just thinking about a lot of things in a way. So it really does require a shift in perspective to help us better respond and connect. One story I'll tell you, just as an example, was because I'm at a university, I was doing a presentation in a community that wasn't my own. And I knew ahead of time, and I wanted to have local information on a slide. And so I put it up on the screen, and I was going over the slide during the presentation, and I was like, this is some data from your community. And I had someone from the community stand up, and she said, "Where did you get this information? Did you go through our tribal IRB to get this information?" And asking me these questions in I guess I'll say a tone, or you could tell that she was kind of angry about it. And I asked myself, because of this lens, I said, what's happening here? Versus if I got reactive, right, I would have been like, oh, this is online. It's readily available. Anyone can look at it, right? But that would have created disconnection, right? It's like, a defensive stance or reactive defensive stance versus saying, what's happening here? And when I asked myself what's happening here, I said, she's just trying to protect her community. And that perspective allowed me to say, thank you so much for bringing this up. I hope that there's someone like you in all of our communities to challenge people about where they get their information and making sure that they go through the appropriate channels to get information that's not public, right? It's your data, it's your tribe's data, and you play a very important role by protecting your community. And I was able to validate her experience, and we actually came together, right? Because it creates connection as opposed to disconnection, that we get to remain in relationship. And that's what having this perspective is all about, as it allows us to understand why people do the things that they do and help us better connect with each other. And that's what's so really powerful about it. Someone asked, some of our advisors say they don't like the words trauma informed because it has the word trauma in it. I heard you say healing informed today. Is that an alternative? Yes, definitely. There's been a lot of change in thinking about trauma informed. At first it was like trauma informed, which is still kind of used. It's pretty widespread. But then people said, well, it's not enough to be informed, you have to be responsive. And so we're trauma responsive. And then they said, oh, but we should focus on resilience, because trauma, we're focusing on the trauma. So we should say like resilient, we should have a resilience team, not a trauma team. We should have focus on resilience. But then people with lived experience were saying, you know, I'm tired of being called resilient. It doesn't resonate with me to focus on resilience because it doesn't acknowledge where I am right now. And so there's been another shift, I guess. In more recently, people have been using the term healing informed or healing centered engagement to think about that particular approach. So it hasn't really caught on. So I feel like we still use some of these terms and many of these terms variously, but that's a little bit of it's been a dialogue, and it continues to be a dialogue, and it hasn't really made that shift really broadly yet. But that's a great question. So we have a lot of potentially harmful practices as a result of not having this lens, right? So if we're not using this lens, you know, trauma is still a problem, whether we pay attention to it or not, whether we're recognizing it and responding or not. These things are happening, and you know, are we really effective if we don't consider trauma and its impacts? And so it really gets at really having and really thinking about how do people experience our environments, and because it's at the end of the day, it's like, well, do youth and families experience us as trauma informed? You know, how do we know we really are? You know, and you'll hear some organizations say we're trauma informed, right? But I feel like that's more of a continuum and a process as opposed to a fixed outcome that we get to. It's more involved and more of an involved effort. So we want to use our lenses. What I most often see in behaviors is that people are either trying to protect themselves or their families or their communities. And that could be because there's not really a belief in justice, that I have to take justice in my own hands. I got to assert myself. I got to protect. And that has a role. So protection, fear, you know, unfairness, you know, there's a lot of things that underlie why behaviors occur, shame. A lot of these things are kind of underlying what we see. So it's really about how we interpret behaviors that are around us, why people do the things they do, and really trying to find various explanations for it. Even some cultural considerations like historical trauma that can get in the way of, the organizations or agencies and communities as a whole. But I think one of the challenging things that people encounter and kind of don't understand about this approach is that, oh, it just means that you have to be empathetic all the time. And don't realize that it does include and has to include accountability, because we can't let people continue to hurt themselves or hurt or cause trauma for other people, right? If we are only empathetic, we're not interrupting trauma for other people or themselves, right? So it does involve accountability. It involves, there does have to be consequences for actions. There does have to be some restorative justice in some way. And so have this, and what I find that gets in the way of people being able to use their lenses is being able to hold those two things at the same time, in connection with one another. And that's a really challenging piece of all this, but it is a part of the process. And there's a lot that can get in the way of using your trauma lens. You can probably use the chat to come up with those that you can think of. There's quite a bit that can come in, especially if you know someone has done something to somebody else, or there are just certain things that could get in the way of you being able to have empathy or look at from this lens. Some that will be harder than the other. So I think it is a journey to really think about this, and it's even hard depending on what's going on in your own life, circumstances, your own stress response system being activated at the time, preventing you from being able to look through the lens, because the lens requires you to stop in the moment and make a shift. And it's easy to react. It's easy to think about how it impacts us, but it requires a lot of work to think about the big picture. What's happening here? This isn't about me specifically. If this weren't happening with me right now, it would be happening with another worker, right? And even, I say this, even if that person's intent was malicious, they really did want to hurt me, specifically, personally, I think, wow, what's happened to this person for them to have that intent? And I still have empathy for that person. Not, with accountability, of course, right? But it's still, you have this deep understanding that people are really hurt in a way, and that it's helpful. It's healing just to even think about it in that way. And I hope, it's just been really meaningful to think about. Let's see. I've already talked about this, so I see a couple of things in the question and answer pieces. let's see, there's a lot of things happening in the state of California that will affect specifically Native special ed students, and some of the overlook of cultural ways. Is there anything in existence that can step to ensure local inclusion or even overlook? Yeah, I think, well, that happens a lot, really. And it, you know, creating something is really thinking about developing something by and for the community it's meant to serve, which is why one of the principles is engagement and really helping people with lived experience and people from the community to be a part of the design process. And that's true for pretty much anything in that. Yeah, and even if we utilize something from outside, we still have to have conversations about how it will work here. And also really conversations about how this exclusion is, again, it causes harm for people. And so it really is about understanding that and how you might message that to create change in where you are. Let's see. One of the other things that's really hopeful as we start to gear toward ending our hour is thinking about there is starting to be research that supports healing regardless of how many ACEs a person has experienced. That PACEs, or these protective or positive experiences that people have in their life, these connections, these cultural engagement, there's all of these things are helpful. That, you know, it is helpful. And I think that's hopeful for people to realize, because I think the message sometimes people get is that I've experienced so many things that it almost seems impossible for healing to happen, right? But we want to carry the message that a lot of things can be healing. And this kind of gets at this collaborative effort. You know, we're really trying to think about these treatments and really broaden that out for communities. What healing practices by whom are most effective for this particular population with this set of difficulties and these circumstances, right? It's going to be a little bit different everywhere, at least comprehensively, but a lot of things are developed outside and for other issues or other things. And I think, you know, one of the things that we can think about is how do we start contributing to the development of these things. And there's been, actually, that's part of the healing that we've seen, is that there's been so many more native focused resources that have been developed. And that's an evidence of healing that we've come to develop. And I say, you know, we tend to get into this controversy around Western developed interventions and traditional interventions at this broader level. And I just say, give it to us all. We need so much healing, give it to us all, and allow individuals to decide how they want to participate and engage in different healing activities or interventions. And because we just need it, we, you know, to get into that. I think both of those things will continue to keep going to add to all of the various healing things that we have at our hands, at our fingertips. So how do we assess what is the outcome here? And I just have us stop and think about this because, sometimes we think about healing as just, oh, we reduced trauma symptoms. We measured trauma symptoms before, and we measured trauma symptoms after, but really thinking about, well, what does healing really mean? How would we know that it's happening? How do we know that we are making improvements? And really taking a closer look at how we define success for ourselves. And so one of the things I say is that I think I've said all this already that's on the slide, but really it's really engaging in multiple things. And it's not just what we do, but how we go about it that helps. And I really like talking about this because I think it'll resonate with you. It usually typically does resonate with people, this thought about getting out of crisis mode. I really observed this during the pandemic, but we've never really stopped since then. And even in our society, we have tended to keep going. We're running around. We're doing things to be more efficient. But for what purpose? To do more work. It's more demands are placed on people. And when you're in this mode of having thousands of things to do and not enough time to get them done, and it can a lot of responsibilities, it can create stress and put you in a stress response system, not just individually, but organizationally and systemically. And what that means is that our organizations, like people who are in this mode, can't plan for the future. You don't have time for training. You're probably multitasking right now. You're not able to think about the future in what you do. You're not able to innovate. You don't want to try anything new because there's unknowns with implementing. So how will it go? Can we do that? This approach and changing things just sounds like just another thing you have to do. And it prevents a lot of growth. And really what I've been trying to emphasize with anyone that I talk to is shifting out of that mode individually, but also organizationally, if we can, because that creates stability, that creates safety, that helps people be able to better shift into using a trauma lens, better able to respond instead of react, better able to really meaningfully be a part of this effort, or really any effort. It doesn't, even if it's not trauma informed, if you're just trying to do something for your system and innovate in an area, it's better to come from a place of, oh, okay, we have thought about this. We know we can engage in this effort, and we want to prioritize this, and we're shifting. And I think it's important. And that means, because if we're able to, because if you're in that mode as a worker, that's not healthy for your own life longevity, right? That's this whole piece around secondary trauma exposure, and being able to be in these positions for much longer. It's hard to innovate in any organization when turnover is so great. And I just really feel strongly that I hope that we can get to a state of stabilization, to take a step back, reflect on what are we doing? What do we truly have the capacity for? What really has to happen, the bottom line, and what really can happen. And there's been a lot of conversations around this nationally that I like to point out, that people are talking about diversifying positions, as opposed to just, this is one role, this is your task that you do, that there's like multiple pieces of the work as part of position, so that it's not just piled onto one particular type of work that people are doing, and just reimagining what this could look like. And so I hope that helps you, especially on last day of the week, to think about how can you shift out of this mode individually, but also hopefully, if your organization's open to it, organizationally, to think about how we stabilize, because then that will help us work toward what we really want to work toward in our communities. So our systems really think about, a lot of collective impacts that we can have, right? Practices, reflection, curiosity, all those things stem from what we just talked about. You make a difference, but we've got to make a collective difference. And there's a lot of, really, a couple of examples. I'll even say that there are tribal communities who are looking at this more community-wide. How do we create, how do we work together? I feel like there have been a lot of wraparound systems of care, philosophies. There's been a lot of social services organization to get people together to work cross collaboratively. There's been a lot of innovations in that area, and that will eventually lead to bringing in other people who haven't typically been at the table, that aren't maybe working in the social services area, but still are very much part of the conversation around the social conditions in our community, like housing, and like TANF and some other programs, right? It's like really helping people come together, but people have to stabilize in order to feel like they can come together intentionally and for a purpose, and see the greater community-wide effort, and really stemming, hopefully, from various people having and utilizing this trauma lens in the process of creating something. So there's just a couple of examples. I don't feel like I can share some of the tribal examples, because they'll speak for themselves when they're ready. But there's a city of Chicago who has a vision and various ways in which they want to tackle these social conditions and broader efforts across the community. And the San Diego County, who has a lot of visioning and recommendations to support their vision. And it really does, these are broad strokes, right? They're broad things. Universal awareness. There's a lot that is within this, and it can almost seem like not attainable, or not realistic, I realize. I'll say, even being in communities and asking people, people have a hard time seeing the healing that has occurred. But there's a lot of healing that has happened all around us. I see a lot of ribbon skirt revitalization, a lot of language revitalization, the substantiation of the Indian Child Welfare Act, the conversation around acknowledging race-based traumatic stress, historical and intergenerational trauma. It's become so widespread and not something novel, or, 20 years ago, people were saying, not really, still questioning whether historical trauma was even a thing, right? We've gotten so far ahead of that now that a lot of people know about it, and really think critically about how they work with our communities. And that's really helpful. And we've innovated in so many ways through tribal self-determination, through taking programs over when we have the capacity to, and delivering services in new ways. And it's been great to see this growth. There's a lot of honoring of traditional practices and thinking about how do we reimburse people for this? How do we think about revitalizing this and incorporating this into different settings? And yeah, there's just so many. I encourage you to, if you want to type in the chat how you evidence of healing that you've seen, like those examples. I see, I'll tell you another thing I see is I see less lateral oppression in my generation than the prior generation. It's just, I just see, and so many more people pursuing higher. I'm here at the University of Montana, so many more people achieving a higher education, which is not the only way for people, but it's one indicator that people are able to do that, even despite a lot of other economic difficulties that our communities face. So I'll be curious to read some of your comments of how you can see that healing has happened. A lot of great things we're in the midst of healing. It's really powerful, along with Deb Holland's listening tour that she did, and this effort to really uplift boarding school experiences, honoring those, and really thinking about what that means for healing from that. Let's see. Someone said, this is a really good comment. I'm going to read it all because I do think it's important. Somebody says, we don't want to empower communities. We don't need anyone coming in to empower us. That was disrupted, destroyed, and taken long ago when the forces of colonization dismissed and demonized our stories. Empowerment implies we never had power, and we need some outside interventions to give it back to us. We've never lost our power to be. The real question, I think, is how do we work towards re-empowering and re-engaging our communities with our stories, traditions, language, and culture. Oh, I just want to copy and paste that and put it on a slide. With hopefully your name, if you ever, it says anonymous. So I feel like, I feel like that's really powerful to think about, is it's just acknowledging. I think what it acknowledges for me is that, we know intrinsically what we need to do. This trauma this impacts us, getting in the way of us being able to get there. And it's really, trauma impacts our ability to have hope for change and think about the possibilities, right? Because we are just, a lot of times just trying to survive, right? And we have to acknowledge where we're at and be able to recognize that there are opportunities for change to happen. And I think that comment just so resonates that where we have collective knowledge just waiting for it to be realized, that it's been impacted by trauma, and it's just waiting for opportunities for engaging people to talk about what they're doing. Thank you, Kia Ora. Yeah, so great. Yeah, so and we have to be able to keep hope. It's so easy to be hopeless. So easy to get sucked into that. And it requires us to be able to hold out hope, even when others don't have it. And I do think we're collectively getting to this point. Even it seems like other people are suffering, and we see people who experience trauma every day, go through horrific things. And you see that, and you're like, oh, we're moving back, but we are moving ahead in other ways, right? Like we hold these two things at the same time. And it's acknowledging what's happening, and then also being able to see how we're healing at the same time too. So we'll open it up for questions or comments. I don't know if anyone feels like they can go off mute and ask your question, or if you want to keep using the Q&A box. But yeah, I'm curious what people's thoughts are about maybe how we go about this. Does it seem unrealistic? Is it hopeful? What would need to happen first as first steps? Yeah, just curious about your reflections after our time together. I don't see any.
Megan, it looks like Glenna has a hand up. I'm going to click allow to talk. Glenna, if you
Okay,
want
I
to come
can't
off
see
mute.
the hand. Yeah, I don't see the hands for some reason. So yes, feel free to help with that.
Looks like we also have another question in the Q&A.
Okay. For the person whose hand raised, are you able to unmute them or?
I have clicked ask to unmute. So Glenna, if you would like to speak, you should be able to unmute now.
Okay, I guess. Oh, sorry, not able to unmute. First step is conversation. Thank you, Glenna. yeah, talking about this, right? We are virtually today. Yeah, bringing this to people, dialogue, and
Stan, I'm sorry. Megan.
go ahead.
I was
Go
going to say
ahead.
we have Stan with a hand up. Stan, if you'd like to go ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, clear.
Excellent. I typed in the Q&A, but I also wanted to just voice it, is that if you could kind of speak to, I participated in a community conversation, and there was a couple of overdoses, and so people were coming together to talk about the epidemic of uh, opioids and methamphetamines in the community, and the harm that it was causing and destruction of, families and whatnot. But there was a kind of a small portion of the people were just saying, like, well, we have traditions to handle these things. We have traditions that, where our people are healthy, and I love that, and I know the power of that, but also the idea that it's not a traditional problem. The fentanyl and the methamphetamine and the social platforms are a new modern issue that's killing our people. So can you speak to kind of the blend and how you integrate and weave the idea of modern issues and problems affecting our families and communities, and tradition needing to be woven together to provide the healing that's needed?
Yeah, that's an important, it's so detrimental, right? Um, it's it's not easy. It's not an easy thing for sure. I think one of the things that come to mind whenever I think about recovery and supporting people, anyone out there, I feel who's struggling, I think, for a lot of our systems, we require people to come to us. And it's really made me think about immersion. How do we immerse people in healing as opposed to going to get it at a place, to go to an appointment, or to go to, right? And I know you still have to go to ceremonies, and you still have to go places in that regard too. But I've just been thinking a lot about how we have a lot of people in our communities who are struggling alone. And they say the Surgeons General's says that our U.S. Surgeons General has came out and said that our next difficulty is going to be loneliness. Our next pandemic is loneliness, which speaks to this need for connection in so many ways. And I just think about immersion, and with substance use in particular, it has a tendency to outcast, right? Because they've already, people want to support them, but not enable, and it can cause disconnection, even more disconnection, when the most that they need is connection during this time. So yeah, I've just been thinking a lot about immersion in traditional healing and other practices, and you know, with things like ceremonies, it's really powerful, but can I do that every day, every night? How can I immerse myself in these kinds of things, connection, a lot of things that we already know, but with regularity, with what's available, right? We don't have that yet in our communities, right? We have to think about that more thoughtfully, and think about and that's what typically happens, right? Is they go off to inpatient treatment, and then they come back, and it's so easy to go back to different ways, right? And it's so difficult, which is why social conditions are so important, because if there's such a high unemployment rate, what's the point? What are people's purpose, meaning? How can they provide for their families? What is the path? And a lot of people can't see the path, that there are no paths for them, right? And so that's why working on these foundational things are so important. You know, in school systems, they say you can't intervene yourself out of a tier 1 problem. And it's similar to this whole outlook, is like, this one intervention can't help us heal on a whole community level, right? It's like inadequate. There's so much more community-wide support that needs to happen to be able to help people more comprehensively. So I feel like I'm rambling on now, but that's what I would say about that. But it is hard. It's hard. It's challenging. If they were easy, we would have already done them already. I you know, because we're capable people, you know, our tribes are capable. We would have done them already if it was easy, you know, but it's a lot. It's a lot to think about. Let's see. Someone said, I'm thinking about the difference between working in a larger urban setting where tribal connection may be lost or less. Yeah, definitely. I know I was talking with an urban program, and they were thinking, well, how do we bring things to people who live in urban areas? And for us in Montana, it's like we're a huge state, and a lot of diversity in our urban areas, and you know, it's like a little bit of both bringing some things in, but also maybe even helping people get home to participate in some of those things, to really be a part of some of those things as well, to create connection in different ways, certainly. But very different situations, right? To be able to work in those settings are different. Someone talked about working in the juvenile justice field and interested in resources to support providers and professionals in the probation world to connect and collaborate with Native families and communities. Definitely. I think, yeah, it's there's a lot of work to be done in all of our settings. Definitely. And after, you know, our time is wrapping up now, but we're definitely happy to continue to be a resource, to be a thought partner, to help think about some of these things. You know, we've really thought about our positionality as an external party, right? We're not going to come in and lead efforts, right? It's got to be community driven and led, but certainly to walk alongside or to help support however we can, definitely. But thank you for coming. I hope that this validates that you are doing work to help heal. You know, that there's a lot of work to be done, but healing is happening. And I hope that it inspires you to yeah, shift out of crisis mode, use the trauma lens, think about what it means to have a trauma lens and use it more often, and think about healing as a whole for the community and what might need to be done to be able to start moving in that direction. We do have a quick evaluation for you to finish. It won't take too much. I think there's only like a few questions and it won't take too long. 4 questions for you for this evaluation. I'm curious to hear your comments always. It's always helpful to be in dialogue about this. And yeah, just Padamaya, thank you for being here on when you didn't have to be. Just to be part of the conversation. So have a great weekend. Thanks for having me.